Text came through while I was standing in the cereal aisle of the Whole Foods on Pearl Street, holding a box of the granola my fiancé liked because he claimed the store brand kind gave him heartburn. I read it twice, then a third time, because the words refused to arrange themselves into something that made sense. I think we both know this isn't working. I felt it for a while. I don't want to do the wedding. I'm sorry to do this over text, but I can't sit across from you and pretend anymore. Please don't make this harder than it has to be. It was a Tuesday. It was 11 days before the wedding. And it was, I want you to understand, the same morning I had picked up the alterations on my dress and left them hanging in the back of my car because the seamstress said the hem was finally perfect. I stood there with the granola in my hand and I waited to feel the thing I was supposed to feel. The floor dropping out. The hot rush behind the eyes. People talk about that moment like a wave, like something that takes you under. I kept waiting for the wave. What I got instead was this strange, flat clarity, like somebody had wiped a foggy window, and there on the other side of the glass was a thing I'd apparently been looking at for months without letting myself see. I put the granola back on the shelf. I want you to know that detail, because it was the first decision I made as a person who was no longer building a life around what gave him heartburn. I put it back and I picked up the kind I actually liked, the one with the dried cherries, and I put it in my cart, and I felt something that was almost a laugh come up out of me right there under the fluorescent lights. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up, because the part that matters isn't the text. The text was just the receipt for something I'd already paid for in installments without realizing. My name doesn't matter much for this. I was 31. I worked as a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm in Boulder, which is a fancy way of saying I was the person who made sure the electricians and the framers and the drywall crews all showed up in the right order and didn't murder each other, and that the client got something close to what they paid for. I was good at it. I was good at it specifically because I could look at a chaotic, half-finished thing and see exactly which piece was load-bearing and which piece was just decoration somebody had gotten attached to. It is a particular kind of joke that I could do that with a 40-unit apartment build and not with my own engagement. His name I'll just give you, because you'll need something to hang him on. Reed. We'd been together 3 years, engaged for 1. He did something in commercial real estate that he described at parties in a way that made it sound enormous, and described to me, on the rare nights he talked about it honestly, in a way that made it sound like he spent most of his time waiting for other men to call him back. The signs were not subtle. That's the thing nobody tells you. In the movies, the betrayal is a smoking gun, a lipstick on a collar, a name that pops up too many times. Mine was quieter and stupider than that, and I think that's why it took me so long. It was the phone, mostly. He'd started keeping it face down on every surface, which I'd told myself was a habit he picked up at work. He'd started leaving the room to take calls that he'd previously have taken right next to me on the couch with his feet in my lap. He'd developed a sudden intense relationship with the gym, a place he had historically regarded the way most people regard the DMV. And there was the wedding. God, the wedding. I'd booked the venue, a renovated barn out near Lyons, with strings of cafe lights and a view of the foothills that made people's chests go tight. I'd picked the caterer, argued them down on the per-plate cost, locked in the band, addressed 140 invitations by hand, because I am the kind of person who thinks that matters. And every single decision I brought to him, he met with the same answer, delivered in the same easy, agreeable voice. Whatever you think is best. I'd taken it for trust. I told my friends when they raised an eyebrow that he just wasn't a details guy, that he was happy to let me run with it, that this was a sign of how much he respected my judgment. I built a whole little cathedral of explanation around a man who, it turned out, simply did not care because he had already decided he was not going to be there. The closest thing I had to a warning was my friend, the one who'd been my roommate in college and was now a labor and delivery nurse who worked too many nights and had run out of patience for nonsense somewhere around her 2nd year on the floor. She came to my last dress fitting. She watched me turn in the mirror, watched the seamstress fuss with the hem, and afterward, in the car, she was quiet in a way she usually wasn't. "Does he seem excited to you?" she asked. "He's not a details guy," I said. The cathedral, brick by brick. That's not what I asked. I didn't answer her. I turned up the radio. I was so sure I had everything under control, and being sure was the whole problem, because a person who is sure has stopped looking. So when the text came, 11 days out, in the cereal aisle, part of me, the project manager part, the part that could see the load-bearing wall, looked at the message and thought, there it is. The thing I'd known and refused to know. It almost felt like relief. The way it feels when a tooth you've been favoring for a week finally just comes out. I did not call him. I want to be very clear about that, because I have replayed this 100 times, and it is the one thing I would not change. I did not call, I did not cry into the phone, I did not ask the question that was clawing up the back of my throat, which was who is she, how long? I stood in the store and I typed back one word, okay. Then I blocked his number. I blocked him on everything, the whole carousel of apps, one after another, standing there by the granola, my thumb moving with a calm that surprised me. By the time I got to my car, the entire architecture of contact between us was simply gone, and I sat in the driver's seat with my dress in its plastic sleeve hanging behind me, and I breathed. Here's what I had not yet understood. Sitting in that parking lot, that the cruelest thing he thought he was doing to me, leaving 11 days out, leaving me holding the deposits and the dress and the 140 hand-addressed envelopes, was about to become the single most useful gift anyone had ever given me. But I didn't know that yet. In that parking lot, I just knew I needed to drive home and that I no longer lived in a story about a wedding. The first thing I did when I got home was a math problem, which tells you everything about how I cope. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and a glass of the cheap wine I kept for cooking, and I added it all up. The venue deposit, non-refundable inside 30 days, which we were well inside of. The caterer half down, the band a quarter, the photographer, the flowers. The dress, mine, already paid for, already perfect. It came to a little over $19,000. Now here's the part I'm not proud of. And the part the labor and delivery nurse would later make me say out loud to her. A good portion of that money was mine. Not all of it. We'd split the venue, technically, meaning he'd Venmo'd me his half of the deposit back in the spring, with a little note that said, for the barn, and an emoji, and I'd put it toward the deposit along with mine. But the caterer, the band, the dress, the flowers, the invitations, the save the dates, the deposit on the honeymoon cabin in Estes Park, all of that had gone on my card. Because I was the one running the project, and we'd had a vague, never-finished conversation about settling up later. It turned out was a country he never intended to visit. I sat there and I felt the old urge rise up, the urge that has been trained into women like a dog learns to sit, which was to eat it, to just absorb the loss, to let it go, to be gracious and wounded, and above it all, to not be the kind of woman who chases a man for money. I felt that urge very strongly, and I poured another inch of the cooking wine and I let myself feel it. And then I did something different. I am not going to tell you I lawyered up, because that makes it sound more dramatic than it was. What I did was, the next morning I called the venue, and the caterer, and the band, and I told each of them in my calm project manager voice that the wedding was canceled. And then I asked each of them a question I'd never have thought to ask the old version of me, the cathedral builder. I asked whose name was on the contract. It was mine. All of them. Every single one. Because I was the one who'd done the work, who'd shown up to the tastings and the walkthroughs, who'd signed where the little arrows pointed while he sat in the car on a call. The contracts were mine. The cancellation terms were a problem I now owned. But so was something else, something I hadn't considered, the right to do whatever I wanted with what had already been paid for. The venue, it turned out, had a clause. If we canceled inside 30 days, we forfeited the deposit, yes, but the deposit secured the date and the space regardless of what we used it for. The barn was mine for that Saturday, whether there was a wedding in it or not. I'd paid for it. It was, in the most literal sense, a room I'd rented and could fill with anything I liked. I want to tell you that a brilliant plan arrived fully formed in that moment. It didn't. What arrived was a much smaller and stranger thought, which was, I am not going to let that beautiful room sit empty on a Saturday, because a man who couldn't be bothered to pick a caterer decided 11 days out that he was done. I called the nurse. I told her the room was paid for. There was a long pause on the line, the kind of pause where you can hear someone's whole face change. "So throw a party," she said. The next 9 days I have trouble describing without sounding unhinged, because I worked on that party the way I'd never worked on the wedding, with a kind of joy that frightened me a little. I didn't cancel the caterer. I called them back and changed the menu to the things I actually wanted, the short rib and the truffle mac and a raw bar, because I love oysters and Reed thought they were disgusting. I kept the band. I called the florist and told her to do whatever made her happiest. No theme, no color story, just go. And then I did the thing that I think of now as the real beginning of everything. I sat down with the guest list, those 140 names, and I went through it line by line, and I crossed off everyone who was his. His college friends, the ones who'd never once asked me a real question. His mother, who had spent her entire engagement referring to the wedding as Reed's big day. His business contacts. I crossed them all off, and the list got short, and then it got honest. 40-some people. My people. The ones who'd shown up. I sent a new invitation. I didn't hire a designer. I made it myself, late at night, and the wording was simple. There would be no wedding, it said. There would instead be a dinner on that Saturday at the bar near Lyons to celebrate the fact that I was, against all odds and several poor decisions, exactly where I needed to be. Come hungry. Wear what makes you feel like yourself. There would be oysters. I almost didn't send it. My thumb hovered. The old voice said this was unhinged, that people would pity me, that I was making a spectacle of a humiliation that a smarter woman would have buried quietly. I thought about the cathedral, all those careful bricks of explanation I'd stacked up to keep from seeing what was right in front of me, and I thought, I am done building things to protect other people from the truth. I sent it. The replies started coming within the hour, and I sat on my kitchen floor and read them, and finally, 11 days late, the wave came. Not for him, for them. For my friend, the nurse who wrote back a single line, "That's my girl." For my college roommate's husband, who I'd always found a little stiff, who wrote 3 paragraphs about how I was the strongest person he knew. For my mother, who was not an effusive woman, who simply wrote, "I'll be there, I'm proud of you," and made me put my face in my hands on the kitchen tile. I did not hear from Reed in those 9 days, the blocking held. I've wondered since whether he tried, whether he showed up against a wall of silence and was confused by it, whether it stung that I had made myself so completely unreachable. I hope it did. I'm allowed to hope that. The Saturday came. The light through the barn windows was exactly as good as the brochure promised. The florist had outdone herself. Great loose armfuls of dahlias and trailing greenery, nothing matching, everything alive. The band played, and the oysters were obscene, and at one point I lived around the room at 40 people who had every reason to be somewhere else on a Saturday night and had chosen instead to be in a barn full of flowers because I had asked them to. And I understood something I want to pass along to you, because I think it's the only useful thing I learned from any of it. I had spent a year planning a day designed to publicly declare my connection to a man who could not be bothered to choose a chicken or a fish, and the room that man left empty I had filled with every person who had actually chosen me over and over for years, in all the small unspectacular ways that turn out to be the only ways that count. The wedding was a performance of love. The dinner was the thing itself. He had not taken the love away from me when he left. He'd only taken away the performance, and stood there thinking he'd taken everything. And the joke, the real joke, was that he'd done me the enormous favor of separating the two, so I could finally see the difference. I stood up to say something. I hadn't planned it. I'm not a speech person. I held my glass, and the room went quiet, and I said the only thing that felt true, which was thank you for coming to the best decision I never made. Now, I know what you're waiting for, because I'd be waiting for it too. You want to know if he came back. He did, of course he did. They always do, when the silence gets loud enough. It was about 3 months later. I'd gotten the wedding refunds I was owed, which were not all of them but were more than I'd expected, because it turns out that when you call a vendor and explain calmly and exactly what happened and ask, plainly, what can be done, people are kinder than the cancellation policy. I'd taken the honeymoon money, the cabin in Estes Park that had been non-refundable, and I'd gone up there alone for the weekend it had been booked for, and I'd sat on the deck with a book and not opened the book once, just looked at the mountains, and it had been one of the best weekends of my life. So when his name appeared unblocked through some side door, an email to my work address, because he knew I'd never see it any other way, I read it with the detachment of a woman reading a letter addressed to someone she used to be. It was long. It was, I'll give him this, articulate, in the way of a man who has had 3 months to draft something. He'd made a terrible mistake. He'd been confused, lost, going through something he couldn't name at the time but could see clearly now. The other woman, and there had been one, a name I recognized faintly from his office, was already gone, had been gone for weeks. He missed me. He missed us. He'd heard about the dinner from a mutual friend, and he couldn't stop thinking about it, about the kind of person who could do something like that. And he realized too late that he'd thrown away the most extraordinary woman he'd ever known. And then they asked, could we talk? Just talk. Coffee, anywhere. His choice or mine, no pressure. He just needed to see my face and say he was sorry in person. He owed me that. He owed us that. I sat with it for a day. I want you to know I didn't fire back something cutting in the heat of the moment, even though I had about 40 cutting things lined up and ready. I sat with it, because I'd learned by then that the calm thing and the slow thing was almost always the strong thing. And then I wrote back, and it was short, the way the okay had been short, because I discovered that the shortest answers are the ones that land. I said, I hope you find what you're looking for. I've already found mine. I did not mean another man. I want to be clear about that, because the easy version of this story ends with me on the arm of someone better, and that's not what happened, or at least not yet, not for a long while. What I meant was me, the woman who put the granola back, the woman who filled the empty room. I'd found her in the wreckage he left, and she was the most extraordinary thing I'd ever gotten my hands on, and I was not about to hand her back over to a man who only wanted her now that he could see, from a distance, what she was worth. He didn't reply. There was nothing to reply to. I closed the door so gently he probably didn't hear it click. People ask me sometimes, the ones who know the story, whether I'm angry, whether I lie awake imagining him miserable. And the honest answer, the one that took me a while to be able to say without performing it, is no, I'm not angry and I don't need him miserable, because his misery was never the point. The point was the room full of dahlias. The point was the oysters he thought were disgusting. The point was the version of me that had been buried under a year of whatever you think is best, who clawed her way out the moment he stopped holding the lid down. He thinks he left me on a Tuesday in a grocery store. What he actually did was hand me back to myself, and then stood there baffled when I refused to give myself away again. I still have the dress. I never could bring myself to sell it. It hangs in the back of my closet, and every so often I take it out and look at it, that perfect hem, and I don't feel sad. I feel like a woman looking at a photograph of a country she almost moved to and is so glad she didn't. I bought the cherry granola again last week. I buy it every week now. It's a small thing, but I think about it every single time. Standing in that same aisle, reaching past the box that gave a man, I no longer think about his imaginary heartburn, and choosing, instead, the thing I actually wanted. That's the whole story. A woman in a grocery store, choosing the thing she actually wanted. It only took me 31 years and $19,000 to learn how. I'd pay it again. The thing I keep coming back to is the granola. Such a small, stupid object to hang an entire life lesson on. But there it is. For 3 years I bought the box that gave Reed imaginary heartburn, and I never once stopped to ask whether I even liked it. That's how it happens. Not in one big betrayal, but in 1,000 tiny surrenders you don't notice you're making until you look up one day and realize you've built your whole self around what someone else can tolerate. Reed didn't ruin my life when he sent that text 11 days out. He just stopped holding down the lid on a box I'd been sitting on top of for a year. Everything that happened after, the dinner, the dahlias, the room full of people who actually chose me, all of it was already inside me. He didn't give me strength, he just got out of the way of it. What I've learned, and what I'd want my own daughter to know if I ever have one, is that the way you carry yourself in the worst moment is not separate from the rest of you, It's the sum of it. I didn't call him and beg because somewhere underneath the cathedral of excuses I'd built, I still knew the difference between what was right for me and what was merely comfortable. That quiet sense of your own worth. The refusal to chase someone who's already shown you who they are. That doesn't appear out of nowhere on the hard day. You build it on the easy ones, in the small choices nobody's watching. And being smart about it mattered just as much. The old version of me would have eaten the $19,000 out of pride, would have called canceling the contracts a kindness, instead of seeing it clearly for what it was. Looking at the wreckage honestly, asking whose name was on the paper, filling the room I'd already paid for instead of letting it sit empty out of shame, that wasn't coldness. That was just refusing to let grief make my decisions for me, but none of it would have meant anything without the part that hurt. Sending that invitation when every instinct screamed that people would pity me, standing up in that barn to speak with no words planned, going up to the cabin alone and learning that my own company was enough, that's the part you can't borrow or fake. You just have to do the frightening thing while you're still afraid, and discover on the other side that you were always strong enough to survive it. He thought he left me in a grocery store on a Tuesday. What he actually did was hand me back to myself, and I will never, as long as I live, give myself away that cheaply again.